Habari Gani, good evening, everybody. I'd like to say that I'm Akoto, and the introductions as you had it. And I'd just like to say, since you're interested in education, is that education starts with family. That there's no reason for education if you don't have a family, other than adults getting skills. And you can do that anywhere in any place that you choose. We started out in 75 actually, with a study group at Howard University. We were students, all of us were students, and we met with, 1968. We were very much inspired by, at that time, Stokely Carmichael, the late Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and he would come on campus and talk to us about the things we need to do as students. And one of the things that caught us was the fact that we needed to meet once a week to decide on our direction and which way we would go. Our study group was formulated back then with that inspiration. Haki Madhubuti came in later on and gave us a little more inspiration. And we started out with a group of 35. And we studied all of the greats from that period, and then we decided that the big and most important thing to do is to look at family development. We were students, and as we graduated together, there were a few of us left. There were about 10 of us who came together to decide on what project we would do. We decided we would do a school. Once we decided to do a school, everyone felt, oh, we can't possibly do a school. We simply don't have the expertise to do a school. So Baba Ajay said, I will do it. I will be the one who will start and be the principal. He was studied music education. We embarked upon the school. We had about 6 people left. After that, started out with 35. We had about 6 people left about that time, and to this day we have 4 of those people who are still remaining after we started our school in 1974. And the reason for starting the school was the birth of our child, our first child. That was the first child in our group, and with the birth of that child, we knew that we as parents had the sole responsibility of educating our children. That God sent those children to us, and it is our responsibility to educate those children. We looked at it like this. There is no mammal in nature that sends their child to be taken care of by another mammal. There is none that leaves their child to be suckled by another. So we as Africans have to recognize that we too must take charge of our families. Our educational institutions started out in order to educate our own children. As we developed over the years, of course, all of the contacts and the organizational administrative contacts that we had, but just giving you a general outline, we developed the school as the children developed. We started out with, what was the number? With 8 students and little ones, 2.5-year-olds, and we went from there. Each year we added a year for the children because they needed to develop until we got to high school. Then we attempted to negotiate with other independent schools in the city to have a collective high school. That didn't work, so we had to bite the bullet and start our own high school. And so our school goes from 2.5 through 12th grade. Our first secondary, 8th grade group graduated our first daughter in 1984, and she and her 2 other graduates were with her. So you can see we started out small. We remained small. We are still small. There was a period in our development where there was a great boom in folks looking for educational institutions, and we had in excess of 120, 130, 180 students we had. That didn't last very long because the economic crunch came. And remember when we started back in the 70s, so that was a period where independent institutions were very popular. There were black institutions all over the country. Shortly after Reagan did his number on the economics, everybody had to have 2.5 salaries in order to survive. So the black independent institutions started to decline, and thus our numbers declined. And then there was the development of what? Our great challenge, the charter school movement, which then co-opted the rest of us so that people, because of the distress of the economics, it was difficult for them to participate in independent schools. Our independent school movement has decreased. Nation House, Ujamaa Shule in Washington, D.C., and Roots Activity Learning Center in Washington, D.C. have remained because ours was family-based, based around families that were absolutely, totally committed to the education of their children and now our grandchildren. And so the way we see the development of and our movement towards sovereign is through family and family development through the education of our children. Our family has 7 adults who have gone through our school system and are now either in college or finished final degrees, attorneys, folks in medical school, all those kinds of things. So the independent school movement is where we need to look. And the independent school movement starts in your home.
That question was a broad one. That was part of the answer, I assume. Why do what we do? And why did we write the book? The independent school movement faced a number of challenges during the course of its development. Of course, the independent school movement is an outgrowth of independent education that Africans have been practicing all along in this country, whether it be formally acknowledged as an independent institution, or whether it was done in the bush, on the side, or in the church back room, or whatever. We've always had a feel or a sense or consciousness of a need for an independent education that is one that is not determined by the state or any form of the state. So the independent movement that developed out of the Black Power movement, coming out of the Civil Rights era, Black Power movement back in the 60s, early and middle 60s, was unique in one fashion, is that it began to focus specifically on an African-centered orientation. Now, when we got started back in 1968, our whole demand at Howard University, for those of you who may remember, was that we were demanding a black education. Now, it took us some years to actually refine the definition of precisely what that was, and the book Nation Building was an outgrowth of that ongoing effort to define precisely what was a black education. And we had to be clear that a black education or an African education is not a blackified mainstream white education. That is, we didn't simply put pictures of African people on the wall and masks on the wall, and then we changed, let's say, the lyrics of Star Spangled Banner to red, black, and green. That was not an African-centered education, which then spoke to the need for an ideological reference. And what we lacked then, what we are only beginning to come into a realization of now, is that we lacked a coherent ideological base from which to develop. That is, we lacked a conception of a strategy, a strategic construct, and beyond that, a cultural ideological paradigm within which we needed to build a curriculum for the school. That is, every curriculum, to back up a moment, we have to see education itself as really being the formalized reproductive system of a system or a polity or a nation. That is, you don't expect to produce an antelope from the uterus of an elephant. Right? And so the uterus is like the educational system of America. And we have to then define not just simply define what that uterus is, what their reproductive organs actually are, what it is that's actually being reproduced. That is, if you send your child through a public school system, what it is designed to do is to reproduce the existing social political order. That's what it is designed to do. And we get confused sometimes in thinking that it is a good school. Precisely. Every school is a good school to the extent it reproduces the social order. If it's a bad school, it simply reproduces the lower end of the reproductive order or the social order that's existing. A bad school where you have a lot of violence and low achievement simply reproduces that level of the social order where most Africans are going to find themselves restrained anyway. So we call it a bad school. But in fact, it's a very effective school. It's doing precisely what it's designed to do. A good school is one where they study Latin, where they have advanced mathematics. It's designed to produce the upper end of the socioeconomic order. So it's a good school, but it is equally effective as the low-performing school. The point is that it is an reproductive organ that's designed to reproduce the existing and dominant social order of the political entity in which we live and reside. So when we recognize that, we have to come to the conclusion that what we need then is another cultural ideological paradigm. We need to have a determined ideology and a fixed strategy by which we're going to produce children that are going to move in a specific direction. Now, it was Malcolm Omowale who initially gave us the statement that only a fool sends his child to the enemy to be educated. And it was reproduced, I think, by Hakeem Mahmoud, who said the same thing in one of his publications. Only a fool sends his child to the enemy to be educated. What we fail to recognize is who or what the enemy is in this social order. Now, we want to apologize for the fact that, this is a white supremacist nation, and it's designed to replicate itself, to perpetuate itself perpetually, to reproduce the order in which it was born, reproduce the order that birthed these various institutions that we take for granted. Now, if we're going to do something effective for our children, we need to extract them and ourselves from that order, from that thing that we take for granted. And we have to begin with an ideological perspective. We have to begin with a specific strategy by which we're going to do that. And which means that we have to look at it in a self-perpetuating fashion. And the notion of Mama Queer notion was family. Families are then the essential component of communities. And what we want to perpetuate is the family and perpetuate the community. And that community has to be defined within a specific historical and cultural construct or context. It has to be, and that cultural context has to identify ourselves specifically as African people. And African, not in an anthropological sense, but African in a cultural sense, that we are an African people. We have been confused about that identity. Not defeated, but confused, because it was never lost. There have always been efforts, conscious and unconscious, to reassert that cultural identity. And so what we have to do is build an ideology and construct a strategy that will then develop and perpetuate that inherent identity, that cultural identity that has never been lost. And that's where the need then, that was then the great weakness then in developing a curriculum that was in fact African-centered. And what that curriculum requires, of course, is instructors that are African-centered, that are committed to that ideology, that are committed to that lifestyle, that don't make any apologies for it. They are African. They want to promote African because they are, in fact, the curriculum, not the paper. It's the teacher. It's the instructor. That's the curriculum. You can get a white person, or you can get an Asian, and give them a piece of paper and they say, well, these are my objectives. But what the children will come out being is speaking like, reproducing the affect, the values, the behavior of the teacher. Because the teacher is in fact the agent of the real curriculum, in spite of what you might have on a piece of paper. So we had to first prepare our teachers. Our teachers then came from families that were themselves, in our group, committed to this cultural construct that we put together. So Nation House has throughout its history made the effort, and it's a struggle. It's a struggle just to survive from day to day, paying the bills from day to day, making payroll from moment to moment. It's a real struggle because it's not popular. And our greatest resistance actually came from our communities, from other African people. That's where the greatest resistance comes from. And it would. That's what happens when the people are confused about their cultural identity. We question the whole notion of what does this thing, African thing, mean? The inherent in it is a sense of inferiority because you believe fundamentally that to be African, to be black, is to be inferior. And so we associate that anything that is African with being incomplete or inferior. So we have to get beyond that. Or at best, for most people, what African-centered education meant was that I'm going to send my child there for a year or two to get fixed. And then I can get a backdoor entrance to the mainstream good school. Right? That's another prominent motivation for people coming to African-centered schools. Not to support and sustain the institution, but to get a backdoor, a fix-up job, quick fix-up, and then I get a backdoor, come to the back door of the good school. Right? That's invariably what we do. Not having either the confidence, the faith, or the vision to see that, no, this is the only way for my child, the future of my family, the continuation of my lineage, and the perpetuation and development of my community. It's that broad sense that's taking a generation to develop. It's taken that long. I'm going to pause there and let Bob Baruti address this issue.
Wow. I've been trying to figure out for the last 2 minutes how you follow that, because it's been said. Now, my first thought was to go into nation building and to find the definition of African-centered. Baba, may I steal that from you? Okay, and I need to find the page. This definition is very important. It's important enough in our house that it's been taken out of the book, and we have it typed up and put inside of a frame, and it's hanging up in the wall, on the wall in the classroom. Okay, I believe that it's here. For those who have a copy of Nation Building, and I told Baba before this began that this book was introduced to me by a student my first year teaching at Morehouse. And this is when I found out about the Akotos, and I've been following them ever since, because this is a serious thing. My honor and respect for people comes from whether they do what they say, not whether they just say it. That's why I am so honored to have the Cambones here today, because I honor them because not only do they do it, but they say it. And I'm going to read this, being the baby here. Being the youngest, don't let the gray hair fool you. I am the baby here, so I am following in the footsteps of the masters. Okay, African-centered education. African-centered education is rooted in the unique history and evolved culture of African people. It is defined in its singular commitment to the elucidation of that history, that culture, and the confirmation, invigoration, and perpetuation of the African collective identity that emanates from that history and culture. African-centered education is concerned with the origins, current status, and future of the African world. African-centered education is committed to correcting the historical distortions born of 3 millennia of foreign invasion, destruction, enslavement, physical and mental colonialism, cultural disruption, and dependency. African-centered education is committed to rooting or anchoring the spiritual and intellectual energies of African people in the spiritual, moral, and philosophical traditions of Africa. African-centered education, whether in the several nations of the diaspora or on the motherland, is concerned to fully develop the sense of African nationality within a broader Pan-African world. African-centered education is concerned to sever irrevocably the pathological and slavish linkage of Africans to the European or Asian ethos. African-centered education is concerned to enable the African person with nation building, nation management, and nation maintenance abilities. African-centered education is concerned to motivate teacher, student, parent, and community to advance the African nation world by any means necessary. I read this at least once a week in my house. And this is the motto, this is the creed by which we stand at our school. And our school is still a baby school. We've only been at this for 9 years now, my Queen Yah and I. And what has been talked about in terms of those things, the wrong things that people bring their children for and what must be done, a lot of people don't understand that this is not just something that you do. This is a nation building process. We're trying to save a people. And you save a people through its children. You have to educate them correctly. You have to be the models of what it means to be African. And you have to know what you're talking about, because if you don't know, you can't teach it. That means that the adults who are responsible for our children, who want to start these schools, they have to study. They have to be prepared. And one thing that has come to mind recently from a lot of folks who I've talked to who want to start independent schools or homeschool is we have to have some very clear definitions of what it means to be African and some even clearer definitions of what it means not to be African. Because we are incorporating things in our teaching and in our homes that in no way, shape, form, or fashion reflect the tradition that we come from, our ancestors. Some of us are even doing things that commit treason against our ancestors. There's a debate going on a site where this is supposed to be an African discussion, and there is a gender-confused individual there who is trying to see if we can just be tolerant of this kind of insanity within our community. And I simply posted a picture of homosexuality and the feminization of African males, and I said, this is not a debate that our ancestors had. This is not something that we should be talking about in terms of whether it is right or wrong. When you engage in a debate with someone about something, that means that you consider it valid. You consider it something worthy of the conversation. This is a waste of time. Now, if you are correcting folks who don't know and don't understand, that's a different animal. But to engage in a debate with someone who is not going to change their mind and is simply trying to convince you that this is an African thing, that's a waste of time. And the children pick up on that. We have to be models of African manhood, models of African womanhood, so these children will know what to do. Now, I wonder what children think when they know that their parents know what these schools are doing to them and they let them go there anyway. I don't understand. Maybe I'm intolerant, but I don't understand, based upon how I was raised and based upon how how we raised our daughter, I don't understand why parents who understand that they're African, who understand that the family was a center of being African and that children were the center of that, why they would allow their children to be sacrificed to the enemy, knowing that this is doing. I wonder what the children think about their parents. Maybe that's why so many African adults are not being respected by the children. Because children know lies when they see it, and they know disrespect when they see it, and they know powerlessness when they see it. And that's something that they see. That's why I honor people who have given up everything to educate our children. And you see examples of it everywhere from people who you know can't afford to do it, who you know aren't really equipped. But they go get the books, they go get the tools, they go straighten up that room or the basement or the garage, and they turn it into a school. And they find other people of like mind who want their children raised up as Africans, not just to go through the first through the 6th or 7th or 8th grade and then dump them off in some school because they've bolstered up their egos a little bit so they can take a little bit of pain from being called what they're not. But who have given up their lives to their children, as in the tradition of our ancestors, to save African minds and to introduce our children to their power so they can act accordingly. This is mind-boggling to me, to listen to people complain about what the school system is doing to their children. And yet they don't do anything to correct them. That's not African. That's absolutely not African.